ZBC News, the real African voice.
1963 comes as a culmination of that ambition.
Around 1900s, the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois of the United States, the likes of Marcus Garvey out of the Caribbean, they stood up as leaders which started championing the cause.
We cannot rule out the discussion of pan-Africanism without including the history of slavery, the history of colonialism as an impact on African development.
The determination of what independence is depends with the perspective that we are viewing the independence from.
The OAU, it lost relevance.
Rebranding is not strategizing. You rebrand after strategizing.
Oh, 2063 is too far. Let's revise this agenda 2063. It's not gonna work.
Africa's problems do not have a single solution.
We can never eradicate problems. That's not possible philosophically.
The G7 wanted to use Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to invade Zimbabwe, to punish us for taking back our land.
What led to the formation of the OAU in 1963? Basically, the OAU was formed because of the need to integrate the continent, to integrate Africans from an economic front, from a political front, and from a social front.
The OAU was championed mainly by the founding president of Ghana,
Kwame Nkrumah realized that Ghana had attained independence, but he said to himself, and I quote, "What is the effect of the independence of Ghana if the other African states remain colonized? Are we to celebrate that form of independence without the independence of Africa as a whole?"
Therefore, there was need for an organizational vehicle to push through the agenda of independence of other African countries. Hence the formation of the OAU in 1963.
To bring about the unification of the African states that had been created as a result of the colonial expansionist move by the Western global order that sought the exploitation and owning of the people of color as a property without rights.
It was to institutionalize the unity of nationalist movements. It was an initiative to also unite nations that had acquired their independence at the time, and also preparing for the future of African independence.
1963 comes as a culmination of that ambition of uniting Africa, which was pronounced by Kwame Nkrumah at the inaugural independence celebration of Ghana.
Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
Africa, prior to the formation of OAU, was disjointed because there was no unison amongst the member states. Everyone was working on their own, and basically the continent was suffering. So the OAU was brought about to try and bring about changes to the woes that the African continent was facing.
Pan-Africanism, in more chronological terms and maybe perhaps in scholarly terms, you've got the Du Bois movement. Later on in 1945, the first Pan-African Congress, no, that was the fifth Pan-African Congress.
Around 1900s, the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois of the United States, the likes of Marcus Garvey out of the Caribbean, they stood up as leaders which started championing the cause of black people, descendants of the formerly enslaved, going back home to Africa. United Kingdom sponsored 3 Pan-African Congresses, 2 in London, 1 in Manchester. France sponsored 1 in Paris, and the US, there was 1 in New York City.
When Ghana became independent in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah deliberately organized what he called an All-African People's Conference in Ghana, 1958. President Mugabe, the late President Mugabe went, the late Vice President Joshua Nkomo was there. Most of the people who then founded the AU, the African Union in Addis Ababa, went to that conference in 1958. And Nkrumah pronounced the vision on behalf of the group to say Africa is not free until South Africa and Namibia are also free. So our first big project and our first statement of where we stand and who we are is to fight apartheid and to free the whole continent. And then from there, we'll see what we can do about reconstruction and other things.
So there was this acquired political soul across the continent where people didn't have these very structured systems, but the shared experience to liberate themselves became that rallying point for unity.
That is the golden era of Pan-Africanism, where we didn't see borders, ironically, where solidarity, African solidarity, was at its maximum. And the era of the late 50s, 60s, 70s remains a benchmark of how to come together. So, you see, this is the time. You know, in 1980, when Zimbabwe gained independence, the new Prime Minister, Robert Mugabe, his first day as Prime Minister, 19 April 1980. If you go to the archives for the Prime Minister's diary, do you know who he met first at 9 a.m. on 18 April 1980? You know, his first ever meeting as Prime Minister, officially, was with Oliver Tambo and Thabo Mbeki. We had come to witness the previous midnight, Zimbabwe's independence, our flag going up in the skies. They had come as ANC. There were many other prime ministers and heads of state and government, but Prime Minister Mugabe met the ANC delegation in his first ever meeting. Now, that is an illustration of how powerful the connections between the liberation movements were. It didn't matter whether the other was now in power or not, but the connection was profound, was beyond description. It's the excellent example of Pan-Africanism.
We cannot rule out the discussion of Pan-Africanism without including the history of slavery, the history of colonialism as an impact on African development, and how Africa then evolved to be the Africa that it is today, with the organizations that have preceded the African Union.
Major value systems that were put forward were basically unity amongst people of Africa. They had to think more in terms of united, a united force, a united community. They also tried to promote regional sovereignty amongst member states, and I think this was quite important in terms of developing the continent. And one of the key values, I think, that also came about as a result of the OAU was that of regional integration and economic engagement.
Issues to do with the rights of the African in terms of the freedoms, the liberties that were entitled to the African in the setting that prevailed then, because we are in a colonial stage. We are in a colonial system that was shaping the current status quo. And to that effect, the values that led to the formation of the African Union, Organization of African Union, are that to seek an emancipated and free African that would contribute and be part of the global economy that had been created.
The OAU really did a lot of work in the arena of promoting solidarity. What is solidarity? Solidarity is when two people, two nations, do not see the difference between themselves, despite physical distance, despite other things that separate them, borders and the like. But they understand each other as one. That is the biggest achievement of the OAU.
It was unity, to say we need to, wherever there is unity, there is the aspect of peace. There was also the ambition to integrate Africa's economies, and there was also an idea to define the political culture of the continent, because these nationalist movements were saying, you know what, we created our script for democracy, and we need to have internal mechanisms that we use to discipline ourselves, internal mechanisms to govern ourselves in consolidating this democracy that we had delivered. So it also brings to the fore the idea that the notion of creation of democracy in Africa was a response to colonial repression. And these were Africans creating a means of democratic self-determination outside the dictates of what Western institutions were propagating.
The agenda against apartheid and other oppressed countries on the continent, were these achieved? In my view, yes, definitely this was really achieved. The OAU really made major strides in that respect. As we speak right now, we no longer have apartheid in South Africa. Most of the former colonies, or those countries that were under colonial rule, eventually got their independence.
The determination of what independence is depends with the perspective that we are viewing the independence from. If we are to speak of political independence, and we assume that political independence is the appending of signatures to declarations as well as peace treaties, to the extent that the colonial masters would cease from controlling the African states without their consent, one would then argue that insofar as that is concerned, on paper there was political independence. Insofar as annexation and colonization is concerned, insofar as apartheid drew with its ripple effects such as racism are concerned. So in that regard, the political independence on paper was there.
Political independence is not enough. We have to go further to cultural and educational emancipation. Chimurenga Chepfungwa, the second African revolution. Because our problem right now is we've got some black men running black countries, but are white in their thinking. You see now, It is better to have a white man running it, because then what you see is what you get. You see, right now we've got a challenge of making sure that the full potential of political independence is translated to educational liberation.
The substantive question then becomes, was there substantive political independence in respect of Africa? And if we are to answer that question to a lesser extent, we would say there was no political independence. The structures and systems that were imposed upon the African states were by far alien to them, to such an extent even after the treaties and declarations were signed to the effect that the African states had independence. African states then continued to suffer under the systems that had been created by the colonial master. The issue becomes systemic, and insofar as that perspective is concerned, there was no independence to that extent. If there was independence, then we would expect that the African leaders that were appointed would go using the dictates of the African values and cultures, but they inherited a system that they were alien to and they did not understand. And in that regard, this is the reason why we still have issues with the system that we have, that is bedridden the African leaders from having the full capacity to control Africa as sovereign states, amongst other things.
As long as we are teaching our kids that Christopher Columbus was a great man, as long as we are teaching our kids that the black man has never invented anything, then we are going nowhere. Because what does it tell us? It tells us that the revolution, the first African revolution, which is what the OAU was working on, is incomplete. And it is urgent, more than urgent and critical, to step in and step up on the issue of the educational front, the cultural front, because these are the key issues.
Osegafu Kwame Nkrumah also presented an important concept that political freedom is not enough without economic independence, seeking economic independence. So you would notice that countries across the continent suffered the scourge of ISAP. They suffered the scourge of debts with these so-called international institutions. And to this day, we still find ourselves negotiating with colonial institutions for issues of debt clearance. And yet there's never been a significant conversation about reparations for slavery. So those are some of the ideological contradictions that upset the overall consciousness and convictions of some pan-Africanists like myself, that we've got a fixation on issues of debt clearances, and yet we do not discuss on the reparations for colonialism, the massacres of our people. We strongly feel that we have to get this external validation by creating debts that emerged out of subscribing to policies of your IMF and the World Bank, where we still think it is legitimate for us to compensate colonialists for looting our land and rightfully repossessing the land to our people.
So in 2001, the OAU was transformed into the African Union. Why was this necessary? I think this was quite necessary because of the challenges that could not be effectively dealt with under the African Union. Like I said, one of the challenges was that of lack of a military force to enforce some of the ideals, and they could not have achieved some of the objectives they had set initially.
There's any institution, in terms of its existence, it has to live up to the moment of the day, of the times, and live up to the spirit of those times.
The OAU had lost relevance. It was necessary to revitalize and reorientate the organization into an organization that's now looking more at the things that are not political, but economic, social, cultural, educational.
Rebranding is not strategizing. You rebrand after strategizing. You don't start by rebranding. My guess, and this is a guess, my guess was that they were getting funding from the European Union for their project, like other projects. If you ask both AU and SADC to produce their audited accounts, or yes, what you will see, what will surprise you, is that too much of the budget is coming from the very same people that we are fighting.
It was necessary in the sense that there were commissions, I think, that yet to be conceived in terms of the structure, and you would also recall that the total independence of Africa had been achieved following South Africa's 1994 breakaway from the apartheid system. So it was reconfiguring the frameworks of the then OAU to meet the new challenges of the continent. And it is around about that time when the debate around African Renaissance began to emerge. So those, I think, were the major highlights that resulted in the institutional transformation of the OAU to the AU.
Agenda 2063 basically looks at a number of key areas in terms of the African continent, looking at issues to do with a better Africa for all, a better education for all, gender equality, human rights, economic development, and these have been integrated with the United Nations and at national level with our economic blueprint, Vision 2030. So all these are trying to really bring about freedom, bring about human rights, bring about gender equality and various other ideals that are good for humanity.
Agenda 2063 for me seeks to achieve issues that are dealing with post-independent effects. Post-independent, the divide and conquer principles were still very inherent in our system as African states. And to that effect, there would be a temptation for the African leaders to self-aggrandize themselves to the extent that if country A is to be liberated and it gets maybe into BRICS, for instance, that is good for its people. But the question that is to be determined at the end of the day is, has the individual African at the bottom of the food chain achieved equality of life? That becomes very difficult. Why? Because we've got an illusion of the residue of colonization. We have neo-imperialism. Neo-imperialism is simply colonization that is clothed itself with the robes of capitalism. So that is a system that was adopted from the Renaissance of the European countries. And to that extent, you would, at the end of the day, realize that maybe we never had independence at the end of the day. But nevertheless, we should applaud ourselves for the fact that indeed there was independence, there was emancipation to a certain extent. That first step is very critical for Africa.
I think the agenda for the attainment of Agenda 2063 of the African Union is a vision that was set to give us a 5-decade span of the progressive trajectory that Africa should chart and ultimately reach that goal through the objectives of a developed, interconnected, modern African state of well-being.
Oh, 2063 is too far. Let's revise this Agenda 2063. It's not going to work. We have to talk about agenda now. Agenda now. Okay? The young people of Africa cannot afford to wait. The people of, there are things that the people of Africa are desperate for. Free movement, opportunity, prosperity. It can't wait for 2063. We call on the authorities of Africa and the African Union, please bring back 2063 and change it from Agenda 2063 to Agenda Now, because we need these things now. You see, what's stopping Africans from removing borders and visas now?
One of the key challenges, or one of the criticisms against the African Union Vision 2060 has been that it has tried to tackle so many key issues, and at the end of the day they may not be able to achieve any. Is this a positive thing, or it's something that needs to be rectified?
Before we rush to critique the weaknesses of the African Union, what we should understand is that our standard should be measured against the people that we were yesterday, as opposed to what Europe is. If we are to measure up to what Europe is and use that as a yardstick, it would then riddle our capacity to grow, because we are different. We can't be comparing a 2-year-old toddler with an 18-year-old major. Why? Because their experiences are totally and diametrically different.
I think it's always good to be as broad as possible, and then in that respect, it allows people to have opportunities to tackle some of these issues at once, other than having one goal and then you try to pursue that single goal. Africa is a big continent, and it is affected by numerous challenges. It is affected by numerous problems, and for us to let some of these problems wait until one of the agendas is addressed, I think would be problematic. So it's best that we open as much space as possible and try to tackle the challenges that can be tackled from a much wider perspective.
The AU's focus on many areas is because Africa has got many problems. It does not make any logical sense to want to pretend as if you are well capacitated and not look at the most minute of problems. If you look at ourselves as a sample of the broader African crisis, we have got water challenges, we have got energy challenges, infrastructure challenges. So you cannot expect our government to have a thin cabinet, in as much you cannot also expect the AU to have thin commissions, because Africa's problems are equally of a wider length and depth. So there is need to also have depth in terms of the combating institutions, the relevant commissions that tackle what other parts of the world may regard as small problems.
We should understand that the fragmentation is as a result of the partitioning process through the Berlin Conference that led to Francophone Africa, Belgian Africa, British Africa, and other remaining conquerors, which are Portugal and to name those. But for scholars, you would want to see the total picture of the Western or European conquership in terms of the conquest that it then later on had. This was a deliberate approach to make sure that Africa will be perpetually divided in terms of its focus.
Why should we use the standards that are European to determine whether we have made progress? In the first place, the reason why we are in a dilemma that we are in is that we are struggling as Africa to determine what standard is good for us. The moment we have standards that determine how we trade with foreign nations, how we trade amongst ourselves, then we can be able to eliminate any external influence. The change should come from within.
The criticism that the African Union does not have funding, it is therefore weakened because it is lacking resources. Is this a major challenge? Is this a major problem for the African Union, and can something be done about it?
It's indignifying that to this day and age we are still banking on funds from Americans through their US aid, the things like China aid and all of that. I know some of these nations are friendly to us, but we need to start thinking in terms of an Africa aid.
We have agreed, and there's a resolution that AU must fund itself. As African countries must fund themselves. You see, 20 years ago or so, the Pan-African Parliament could not have a meeting in Johannesburg because the USA had not made the money available. And there was an article in BBC, PAP is too broke to meet. Surely, 60 years after independence, we rely on Americans to fund our meetings. Are we? Yeah, you see, but we have agreed that we should fund our own programs. If the AU's funding is not coming from member states, yes.
Well, I think it's not just the AU. You'd also recall that there's the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Institute in Tanzania. Government, fellow liberation movements put it upon themselves to ensure that they pay subscriptions to this body.
We have member states who are passengers in the AU. And by the way, even if they don't pay for 3, 5, 10 years, nothing happens to them. Nothing. Yeah. You see, so these are the things related to the issue of the Constitutive Act of the AU.
We need to have a very clear framework where, as African nations, we inject funds into this institution so that we start thinking of an internal humanitarian framework that would tackle problems in Somalia, that would tackle problems, be it in Zimbabwe, be it in Botswana.
If we are dealing with a capitalist maybe funder, that funder or sponsor would definitely be looking out for their own interests. So we should not only understand this from the relationship of who colonized who, but we should also understand the history of those who colonized us. They went through a renaissance, which is a rebirth, which you are yet to go through. Thabo Mbeki tried it, Marcus Garvey tried it, Gaddafi tried it. What was the end goal? What was the end outcome? They disappeared into thin air. Why? Because they are trying to promote a certain important integral step that will also advance the interests of Africa as much as it did to our Western counterparts.
This becomes a major challenge that the heads of states on the African continent need to put their heads on, because you can, even if you come up with solutions but without a budget for it, it's simply a waste of time. So it's high time that we prioritize generating revenue so that we address challenges if we are serious. We cannot have problems and have a dependency syndrome on others to help us address our problems.
Africa's problems do not have a single solution.
We can never eradicate problems. That's not possible philosophically.
There are so many of them. One of them is simply to have teams which are effective. The AU created the African Liberation Committee, and that's why we have the Museum of African Liberation here. You create effective institutions. Don't just create institutions in imitation to other organizations.
Africa suffers a lot in many areas because it is economically unstable. And for Africa to be free, for Africa to be independent, it has to be economically stable. We are a laughing stock when we go out there outside of Africa, because everyone assumes that we are economic refugees. And when you're an economic refugee, it's very difficult for you to gain respect or to earn respect. So once Africa has a firm economic footing, it is in a position to address its own challenges.
The first solution that I believe would give Africa the emancipation that it needs, change of the mindset. But a change of the mindset does not happen until we have a system overhaul. What does a system overhaul do? If your body has been infected by a lot of bacteria, You have to get medication that will get the bacteria out of your system so that your system can independently function. The first thing is, in as much as we might have achieved political independence, we did not achieve political independence. We inherited systems that are alien to us. We cannot maneuver through the systems that are way ahead of us. Systems are determined by the historical spans that you go through. Take for instance, we've got the Industrial Revolution. We've got the move from the Dark Ages. We've got the Middle Ages. Amongst a lot of things, even if you are to take the biblical perspective, we've got the silent years. What was happening during those silent years? There was reformation. In the absence of African Renaissance, it will be difficult for us to maneuver through what we are going through.
The problems we want to eradicate are problems of quality of life. We need to increase our quality of life. That's why I say, can Agenda 2063 be converted to Agenda Now so that there's intensity and agency in attending to these things? We can't wait for 2063.
We must not shy away from ensuring that we have got full control of our mineral resources. I'm happy with the beneficiation trajectory on the lithium side. We want to see more of that. And we need to start thinking in terms of generating our own capitalists that dominate the world, be it in the mining. We need to have this very deliberate policy of inventing our own Zimbabwean capitalists that dominate the global market.
It's over 400 years. The Jews have called back their diaspora. They don't have to move to Israel, but they participate in the development of Israel. The Irish have done the same. The Chinese, the Indians, all other countries, they are calling on their diaspora to participate in the development of Africa. They are creating pathways for them to be able to participate in their growth. It is only Africa that continues to ignore almost 400 million people, children of Africa, that were forcibly taken out of Africa. We are saying that story that is over 400 years, it must end in 2023. The story that started over 400 years ago must end.
The wisdom of our founding fathers is that they strategized, which is to say, you look at your weaknesses as well as your strengths within a global system. And they realized, for instance, in 2008, the G7 wanted to use Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to invade Zimbabwe, to punish us for taking back our land, to punish us for intervening in DRC. Then President Robert Mugabe and the people around him really understood that global system. And they said, how do we survive? We are a little country. We are targeted by big powers, and they are going to squash us. So they engaged seriously. The Chinese, the Russians, and the South Africans, who had a critical vote in the Security Council. That's how we survived. So you have to strategize in the same way. Understand your weaknesses, understand your strengths, understand who your allies are, and then maneuver with a view to strengthening the little that you have. Just like the one newspaper which was read by 3,000 people in the liberation struggle. It will just go from one dariro to another throughout the villages until the whole district actually had the information.
How can Africa move away from the Western ideology and become more African-oriented in terms of their thinking and in terms of their ideologies? The biggest challenge that Africa has faced, or that Africa continues to face today, is basically the neo-colonial mind or the colonial mindset. We remain trapped in the colonial mindset. We remain trapped in the colonial systems. And for us to regain control of our destiny, we need to rediscover ourselves. We need to reimagine ourselves. We need to go back to our roots. And that is the basis. Africa was on the trajectory of development. We can boast of numerous civilizations prior to the coming in of colonialism, which indicates that we indeed were on the path to development. We can talk about Great Zimbabwe dating back to the 13th century. We can talk about Mapungubwe, 12th century. We can talk about the Kamifei sites. We talk about ancient Egypt. We talk about various civilizations on the African continent, which indicated that the people of Africa really were having their hands on the deck in terms of political development, in terms of economic development. Through trade, they were in contact with the international community, with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Europeans. They were in contact with them prior to that. So we certainly were on the path of development. But then the coming of colonialism stripped us of everything that we had. They took away our land, they took away our culture, they took away our religion, they took away everything that we had and imposed something that was foreign to us, something that was not familiar with our customs and traditions. And we have been left with that. And now we are trying to find our footing where we have no connection with this foreign kind of system that has been imposed on us. And for us to really to begin to move forward, we need to go back to our roots and pick the pieces from where we had, and then we begin to move forward. Because everything that we are dealing with now in terms of development is basically coming from the West. Yet the bigger part of our communities have access to these natural resources, and they knew how to tap. And so we need to think about ways in which we can maximize on the local resources that we have, the potential that we have had, and we move forward from there. As long as we remain trapped in these colonial structures and systems, we're definitely not going anywhere.
There is only one way to encourage Pan-African thought. It's educational. And I want to talk about, in conclusion, repatriation. And when I talk about repatriation, I mean repatriation of our minds. Because our educational system is producing deputy Europeans. Most of us are actually are staying in Europe mentally and in terms of thinking. Let's come back. That is repatriation. Repatriation is not physical, it's educational. Okay? It's educational. Let's come back here. Like I said, I heard that in school right now, they are teaching kids English and they are telling kids, say as white as snow. How do you teach a Zimbabwean kid as white as snow when they've never seen snow? Why can't you say as white as milk, which they see every morning? You see, this is trying to mentally, educationally, remove the kid from his environment. You see, it is good that our both ministries responsible for education are talking about heritage-based education, and that is a step in the right direction. But it's going to be a long walk. And can we actually expedite this process?
I strongly feel we need to unite and be very sincere about what we want. Nations need to sacrifice resources, and we need to push institutional interests other than pushing partisan interests, other than pushing individual interests, because at the end of the day, it is the continent that must win. It is the continent that must have the same dignity of interacting with other players in the international scene from a point of fairness. And you don't earn that fairness on the basis of morality, because there is no morality in the international system. You earn that fairness because you've got the capital. You earn that fairness because you've got the intellectual capacity. You earn that fairness because you've got the infrastructure, because you're contributing something into the technological ecosystem of the global system.
Africans must realize the immense sacrifice that was created as a foundational base by the founding fathers, that led to nationalism, that led to the protracted war to liberate ourselves as Africans and as Zimbabweans in particular.
What is Zimbabwe without Africa? And what is Africa without Zimbabwe? But nevertheless, for the purposes of articulating the question, This is what you should understand. Nyika inowakwa newene, Africa inowakwa newene.
China does not look outside China for development of China. Europe does not look outside Europe for the development of Europe. It is only Africa that looks outside Africa for the development of Africa.
Most people might critique that approach to business, but it is the best business approach that we can have. Remember, the business model that sold away Africa was on the basis that we dealt on the terms of the colonial master as opposed to our own terms. And we dealt with the cultural legislation that governs us from within, that is naturally ingrained in us, that is a blueprint given us by Masoka. Then we would be in a position to say every standard that is set for the Africans should be on the African standard.
My message to Africa in celebrating Africa Day is that let's all be proud of our identity as Africans. You're speaking to someone who is an archaeologist, who is a heritage professional, and I know the value of our identity as African people. I know the value of our achievements. I know what we have achieved prior to us having these external influences. And as Africans, we need to take pride in who we are. We need to take pride in our own skin, take pride in our own history, take pride in our own heritage, take pride in our own education system. In fact, everything is captured within what we call indigenous knowledge systems. This is what captured our pharmacies, this is what captured our industries, this is what captured our religion. Everything was packaged within our indigenous knowledge systems. And it's high time that we move back to that and really see where we lost it and try to, tap into that which was taken away from us through colonialism. So we are a people with a lot of potential, but as long as we remain lost in terms of who we are definitely going to remain in this wilderness, and the West will continue to exploit us and will remain a laughingstock across the continent.
The development trajectory that has been set within a world structure and order that existed for the past 400, 500 years must also have a contribution of the African people. We must not be left behind as a people of color within the 21st century to contribute to humanity, to the shaping of how humanity must ultimately be shaped in terms of the outcome, the outlook. And that worldview of the African must be based on the origins of belonging, to say, where do I belong to geographically? It doesn't matter even if you are around the globe, because the people of color have contributed to the world's civilization that we see. Hence, you see the people of color in every corner of the globe. So the Africans in the diaspora also must realize that they must connect with the homeland in as far as making sure that we develop the Africa to meet and match or even surpass the current Western world.
We are saying there is not a single Fortune 500 company in the world that you can go to that you don't find people of African descent in very top leadership roles. You have professionals at every level. There is nothing Africa needs that cannot be found in her children on the continent of Africa and outside Africa. We are also saying the African heads of states have not reached to us as African diaspora because we are not organized. So we are owning that. We are owning our disunity.
One, we need to love our countries. We need to love our content and our continent, and the ultimate expression of loving our continent would be allowing the idea of the nation to live, so that for the idea of the nation to die, so that pan-Africanism may live. Being a patriotic Zimbabwean, of course, means loving your country, doing what is right for your country. Being a patriot means allowing your political or your partisan views to taking a partisan position if you want, but not allowing the partisan position to override national interests. And then when I say for Pan-Africanism to live, nations must die, I simply mean the myth that has caused us to look at each other on the basis of ethnic essentialism, which in some instances has created xenophobia. When I say the nation must die for Pan-Africanism to live, I mean we need to rethink the idea of the superficial borders and look at ourselves in terms of building a collective economic infrastructure for ourselves and ensuring that we allow the movement of goods and services from one part of the continent to another in unfettered terms. If we can allow colonialists to come with backpacks in any part of the continent unbothered, why are we not doing that for our trade border women?
We are not in a routine situation. In the world is not in a routine situation. So if there are routine celebrations, like the Africa Day, Women's Day, this day, let's figure out how to make them better than routine.
ZBC News, the real African voice.